You must tell me all your secrets. Remember, we must share everything together. Everything.
Hello again, this is Annie Rose Malamet, and you're listening to Girls, Guts, and Giallo. And today I'm bringing you a special little 4-part miniseries. This is the first in a 4-part miniseries that I'm doing with my brother in filth, Kamikaze Jones, called Anal-Auteurs. This was a title that Kamikaze came up with. And I absolutely love it. And this is our 4-part kind of deep dive into 4 gay porn directors of the 1970s that we believe are enigmatic of the time and place. And we're going to explore some of the themes and content that comes up in their films. So this is our first part of Anal-Auteurs. And Kamikaze Jones, can you introduce yourself? Who are you?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Annie, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to go into this anal tour experience and really raw dog it with you. Uh, I am an interdisciplinary artist who primarily focuses in the realms of extended vocal technique, sound art, and video art and performance art. A lot of my work has to do with queer hauntologies, porn studies. I like to consider myself not necessarily the most dedicated archivist, but more of a porn detective. And a lot of the work that I do uses kind of the gaps in the queer pornographic archive and like marginalized erotic legacies as like a locus for um, utopian revisionism or interventionist practices in art. So that's kind of the lens that I'm using to approach our lovely collaboration.
Amazing. I love listening to you talk about your work.
Oh, I appreciate that. And you, obviously.
Tell me about some stuff you're doing right now because you are doing another project that I'm part of.
Yes, very much so. So I am the head filth correspondent at Wussy Magazine. For those of you who don't know, is an amazing queer art and nightlife and culture enterprise that's based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And this is the first podcast of the kind that they are doing. And it is a collaboration between me and the Wussy editor-in-chief, John Dean, that is called Pure Garbage. And our first season is an oral examination of the filmography and legacy of John Waters. And the ethos behind Pure Garbage is to explore the history of the queer transgressive through literature, through culture, through film, obviously, and to see how these kind of paradigms of filth and the transgressive inform queer ideologies in the contemporary sphere as well as throughout history. And Annie and I have a lovely interview forthcoming about the politics of fatness in John Waters' oeuvre.
Yes, I'm very excited for that to come out. I'm obviously a gigantic John Waters fan. Talked about him a lot on this podcast, and it's going to be great. There's so many amazing people part of it, like the man himself, and Mink Stoll, Brontez Purnell, Bruce LaBruce. It's going to be so cool.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun folks involved, and maybe some surprises depending on whether or not publicists continue to flake on me. So we'll see.
Mm.
But we have Willem from Drag Race. We have Eureka O'Hara, who actually reprised the divine role in Women Behind Bars with Tracy Lords recently,
Oh,
and Mink
cool.
Stoll. Yeah, and then I'm trying to. There's a couple of other great people. Darren Stein, the director of Jawbreakers,
Yes, yeah.
involved.
Big
Peaches
fan.
Christ. And it's really Christine and Dynasty Handbag, who are both incredible performers, pioneering, contemporary post-transgressive aesthetics and filth in their work. So
Yes. What would you consider, like, can you define post transgressive? Because we talk so much about transgressive. I mean, that's the whole podcast. So, what does that mean to you?
So I think I have perhaps a pretty, I'm not going to say singular perspective, but my understanding of the evolution and the etymology of transgressive art and literature has always been a bit less fixed than a lot of people that I know. And this is always kind of a discourse that I have with people. Um, I think that, like the transgressive for me has always kind of been something that challenges, societal norms. And also, I think, in the early movements of transgressive literature with like the work of like George Bataille, a lot of it is based around somatic knowledge and the body as a site for accessing knowledge that can't be accessed through language or through predominant social avenues or conduits. So my idea of the post-transgressive is, when like in the 90s when like it was like transgressive chic and it was like everyone was reading Chuck Palahniuk and like and it was
Yes.
like
Yeah.
and it was very, there was like, it was rooted in misogyny and like,
Mhm.
like edgelord aesthetics and like E-bombs world. And like, I think for me, post-transgressive, a lot of the work that really I think resonates with me is like the works of Kathy Acker or Samuel Delany and notions of the unspeakable in Samuel Delany's work, and like how a lot of queer eroticism is obviously sublimated and like erased from public life. And a lot of the work that I try to do is provide sonic and sculptural sanctuary for the ghosts of public sex. Is kind of like a fragment of my
Fuck
mission
yeah.
statement.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also have a piece coming out with Black Mountain College Museum, a radio art piece that is called Degeneration Loops, where I basically take audio ephemera from porn and turn them into tape loops and then deconstruct them with scalpels and whatever implements I have lying around so you can hear the degeneration in real time. And that directly invokes William Basinski's work with the disintegration loops. So
Oh, I love your big, beautiful brain. That's so cool. Are you familiar with the work of Pacifico Solano?
no, I don't believe so.
So he was also on this podcast way back when I did an episode on cruising, and his work is probably a little bit more like rooted in formalism than yours, I think. But
Mhm.
he is a photographer and he works a lot with found photography, and he, I believe, has a permanent collection right now in the Andy Warhol Museum, and he takes Blue Boy magazines and other gay porn magazines and reappropriates the imagery and makes them these really like beautiful kind of formal found photographs. So to talk about very similar to what you're talking about the disappearance of these institutions, and also, of course, talking about the ephemeral nature of these objects in relationship to the AIDS crisis, and how a lot of these subjects are just, we don't know their names or they're not alive anymore.
Yeah.
So, yeah, also highly recommend checking out his work.
Oh yeah, I can't wait to check out his work. And yeah, and there's so many different types of invisibility or erasure as it pertains to the queer experience. And some of it is weaponized by the state, and some of it is, utilized to avoid persecution. And like a lot of those things, those porosities and those slippages kind of congeal in the public imagination in a lot of really interesting ways that I think are ripe for exploration. And this might be uh, formal archiving, which might be a good time to plug our buddies at Ask Anybody.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So there is a podcast all about gay porn called Ask Anybody. And the folks over there, you're more familiar with them, but I'm a big fan of Liz and the work that she does. And if you need really rigorous historical detail about these films, or that's something you want as a companion piece to this, highly recommend going to listen to that podcast, because we're going to focus a lot more on the thematic elements.
Yeah, thematic elements, and I think like echoes and ripples throughout culture and theory. I think like Elizabeth, Tyler, and Keegan do really beautiful work, and I highly recommend giving them a listen. And they're always involved with restoring like lost films. Like Elizabeth found this amazing film called Sex Demon, which is a gay porn parody of The Exorcist, and I believe she has the only existing print. And she's doing a series of screenings of that throughout the States. And she also has a series coming up, I think, at Anthology Film Archives in New York for October, which is all, I think, 16 millimeter restorations of porn, gay porn, classic gay porn. So definitely, we love them. Go check them out.
They're really amazing, and I've been listening to them a lot as research for this episode, and they leave no stone unturned. Like, they are amazing archivists. So the first director that we're talking about today is Peter Jerome. And I was not familiar with his work. I heard the name, but I was not familiar with his work until I started doing research for this episode. What is your relationship to this work?
It's interesting. I think that you know, as I'm sure you have, I used to dabble in the occult more so than I do now. And I think I was watching a compilation through Bijou World Video of occult sequences in classic gay pornography, and that's how I originally came across The Destroying Angel. And I was also really fascinated with the music, and like a lot of the work that I do has to do with like sonic ephemeralities in queer porn, and like these composers who either purposefully or just through the sands of time have like not had their work properly cataloged. And I think David Ernest's soundtrack for this is really fascinating, and also like the music by Stockhausen that's used. I think there's a Brian Eno snippet in there. A lot of gay porn of the time, doesn't worry about musical licensing, and there's some Pink Floyd stuff going on in here. So I think I came through it through like just a general curiosity of horror and porn music.
The music in these films, and especially in the Peter Jerome films, incredible.
Yeah.
So good. Like, such weird experimental stuff going on there. I need a vinyl of like, somebody needs to make that happen, because I absolutely loved it. And the Pink Floyd, like, Welcome to Machine, right in the beginning of Destroying Angels, so good. I think that Pink Floyd were kind of upset about how much they were used in gay porn, but fuck them.
Yeah, and David Ernest was like the in-house composer for a lot of the films that were produced by Hand in Hand Productions, which The Destroying Angel and the other film, the Peter Jerome film that we're going to be talking about, Adam and Eve, both had original soundtracks by David Ernest, and Hand in Hand Films produced these films, and was primarily the work of Jack DeVoe, who is also an auteur that I believe that we plan on focusing on
Yeah,
at a later date.
absolutely. Yeah, he'll have his own episode. So Peter Jerome is a British and English guy from Kentwood. He relocates to New York City in 1956 to pursue a gayer life, I imagine, and fell into commercial filmmaking sort of accidentally, because he started making these 8 millimeter shorts, which he would meet these guys in the park and bring them home and make these little erotic movies. The BFI has a whole compilation of his short films called The Erotic Films of Peter Jerome. You can rent it on gayhotmovies.com. A lot of people don't know about gayhotmovies.com. You can rent stuff there for $5, and you get it for 2 weeks. It's great. And he meets Jack DeVoe and Robert Alvarez at a party, who were both heavily involved in Hand in Hand. And they, have the idea to take these films and blow them up to 16 millimeter, and they were a great success. They're seen as very classy, like combining the art house and the smut aesthetic.
Yeah, and they were the toast of the town at the time. I believe Jack DeVoe's ballet Down the Highway was attended by Tennessee Williams, Divine. There's like publicity photos of Tennessee and Divine mixing at this screening. Salvador Dali was showing up to screenings by Fred Halstead, who was not a Hand in Hand auteur, but it was very much like the apotheosis of the golden age of porno chic in a lot of ways, like being seen at these events, being faggots about town, so to speak.
Bring it back. We we need to make it cool to go to porn screenings again.
I
Uh,
know.
right?
Absolutely. Well, there's
He,
the you are have you ever been to like a dirty look screening or anything like that?
I
Those
have,
are
yeah, yeah, those are great.
they're in your neck of the woods, right?
And I've been to some. They've done some in New York too. That I've been to. Yes, no, those are Dirty Looks is great, and he is obviously heavily influenced by Kenneth Anger,
Hmm.
who is we're talking a little bit about the occult. Like these are 70s movies, so American occult revival, American and UK occult revival is in full swing right now.
And also something really, I was speaking to Adam Barron recently, who's also someone who's heavily invested in the history of gay pornography, and he was telling me that there's a lost film that Kenneth Anger made with Aleister Crowley that is, which I had never heard about
I've heard the
before.
whisperings.
Yeah, the murmurings, the
Yeah.
the esoteric murmurings. But yeah, I think that thinking of that lens of like the British and American synthesis of occult practices, it's really interesting to think about with this lost film between Kenneth and Alistair, and particularly in regards to the Destroying Angel.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very popular at the time. You probably are all familiar with like psychedelic occult imagery, but you know, post hippie movement, post Manson murders, this becomes a big thing, and that's also part of uh, the movie. One of the movies we're talking about, The Destroying Angel. There's an occult element in the film. And in one of the short films that I watched from Peter Jerome, there is actually a man jerking off interspliced with footage of fireworks, which is obviously a reference to Kenneth Anger's famous fireworks film, experimental short film. So he's very invested in referencing references. There's so many cinematic references in these films, especially with Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
And he, one of his things that he says, speaking of film references, is that he had a particular attraction to black men. And Peter Jerome himself said that including one black man in his films was like his quote unquote Hitchcock signature, which is very cringe.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with Peter Jerome's treatment of the black male form and black male identity, particularly in Adam and Eve. And I am very prepared to do a deep dive into that. I think, well, there's one scene in Adam and Eve. I guess you could consider it the climax, but it's a fantasy that is told from the perspective of like the white lead protagonist that features a 10-person all male black orgy in a theater bathroom. And there's lots of reasons that it's problematic, but it was also, I think, the first time that it ever actually occurred in the history of gay porn. I don't think you'd seen anything like that where you'd seen that many uh, black men in a scene of that sort up, and I don't think it happens again until the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, with black owned queer production companies like Satellite and Black Forest. But that's a whole other can of worms. I was also, when I was doing research for this interview, I was looking at the credits on IMDb, and all of the actors in that scene aren't even attributed as like their personhood is completely effaced. It's just in the bathroom. Each actor is credited as in the bathroom. So
Mm.
that's a whole another thing.
Yeah, and that's the piss orgy, right? Or no, that's Destroying Angel. Is there piss in this
Yeah.
one too?
There is an interesting correlation between urine and class that happens in both films. I think
Mm.
in Adam and Eve, you get this like aside about this probably non-existent ritual that gay men in Paris have, where they dip their baguettes in urine in the urinals, in the pissoirs, and they call it, I think in the movie, like the poor man's rum baba or something. and and then later in the film you have this culminating all black male orgy in the bathroom. So I think that's kind of saying, and then before that, all the scenes with white men take place in front of like cozy fireplaces or like unfurnished pied-a-terres, because Adam and Eve is in some ways a direct parody of Last Tango in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
So the contrast is pretty glaring to this humble porn detective, and the parallels that he's making between class and the act of waste leaving one's body, or this kind of ritualization of piss. And then that happens again in The Destroying Angel, where the impetus for that piss scene, where I think the lead is being urinated on by a bunch of anonymous men, has to do with this ancient Vedic ritual of the impoverished drinking the piss of people who are tripping on soma, or a hallucinogenic plant, so they can stay high for days. So yeah, there's a couple of interesting parallels there.
So much urine. Of course, you briefly mentioned Georges Bataille, got me thinking about that as well, because we just read Story of the Eye for the Patreon book club, which is one of my all-time favorites.
Same here.
Of course it is. And I also love the Georges Bataille text on eroticism and death and sensuality called Erotism. And, speaking of transgression, Georges Bataille defines, that the taboo is the societal moray that, like, the breaking the societal moray, like the taboo is the thing that sets it up as something that you can't access, that is like, something we can't breach. And then the transgression is breaking the taboo. Mm-hmm. So interesting to think about in terms of what you were talking about with post-transgression. What does transgression mean when there's no more taboos to be broken, right? In this culture that we live in now.
Yes, and to piggyback on that, what does transgression look like when it's inclusive and actually informed by this idea of ethics, queer or otherwise? And I think that's why I obviously mentioned the work of like Samuel Delany, but also thinking of Titen seems like a pretty primary example of that. I think Crash by Cronenberg seems like an interesting example of the shift away from, the explicitly misogynist tendencies of transgressive cinema, or like
Shock Factor.
I think some of Catherine Breillat's work speaks to that, which is also, I found a really interesting parallel that I didn't realize, but Catherine actually played a young dressmaker named Mouchette in Last Tango in Paris.
Interesting.
And
of course, Mouchette is the Bresson film, which is another famous transgressive piece of cinema.
So that's like a weird history to disentangle in terms of pockets of transgression and what an ethical transgression can look like, and an inclusive one.
Right. Yeah. That's such an interesting point, because transgression has so much lived in the realm of the edgelord misogynist, so much so that there's been constant historical conflict in queer and feminist communities about the use of shocking imagery, seen as kind of the realm of the misogynist auteur. So in queer people who have been interested in these things or have non-normative sexual expressions have been sort of lambasted in the community. So yeah, a lot of complicated stuff in relation to the history of transgression going on there. So I like this term, post-transgression.
Yeah, I know that it was actually, I'm not sure if it was coined by a theorist who is writing about Samuel Delany. Maybe I'll follow up on that after the interview, but I'll send you the essay that I'm thinking about. And yeah, I think I've always been a bit more pliable than a lot of people with that term. and you know, I imagine that you, my sister, and Filth also have similar feelings about respectability politics and how queer people utilize and uh, implement the transgressive in a way that reclaims our autonomy.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I have many feelings about that. Yeah, so, Peter Jerome is someone that, this is very transgressive work. And at the same time, like, his treatment of the black body is really status quo. So, interesting interplay there because we're talking about some, highly marginalized work that at the same time was so celebrated in certain circles, but was also experiencing. I actually don't know about Peter Jerome specifically, but I know Fred Halstead was experienced a lot of censorship and the police seizing his films and things like that. So uh, the interplay between transgression and the normative is very interesting to me here.
Very much so, and also the idea of the Baroque and this kind of I guess erotic elitism that happens with like a lot of these classical orchestrations in these films and a lot of these allusions to literature, like classical literature, classical art. I mean, the pre-Hays Code film Queen Christina is a visual reference that used in Adam and Eve, and also was a way of marketing the film because Peter Jerome waited outside of Greta Garbo's apartment, I think, for a week or so before catching some very furtive footage of her doing one of her speed walks or her constitutionals, and then used that as a point of selling the film and advertising it as Greta Garbo's final screen appearance, which is just a hurried and surreptitious shot of her doing her speed walk
in a gay porn. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Adam and Eve is from 1974. It's got obviously this very cheeky title. Eve is spelled Yves. It's also a man's name. And the IMDb summary just cracked me up because it says in Paris, hairy French Eve and blonde American Adam play games and relate sexual tales and fantasies to one another. So first of all, the emphasis on hairy French Eve cracked me up. But then the sexual games and fantasies they play are based on film scenes, which is very important.
Yeah, and then would echo Bertolucci's later work, The Dreamers, with
Mm-hmm.
Michael Pitt and Louis Garrel and Eva Green. And I think this idea of mimesis is pretty integral to the history of gay pornography in terms of seeing representations of ourselves through popular culture. And a lot of these films also had to do this as a survival strategy because it was the only way they could prove that they had artistic merit is by kind of weaponizing the themes of popular films at the time or like using them as their infrastructure. And that also obviously speaks to camp sensibility and the idea of mimicry and all of these very innately queer strategies that are utilized in the golden age of gay pornography.
That's such an interesting point. I mean, Peter Jerome was very upfront that this film was heavily inspired by Last Tango in Paris. Like you said, it's almost kind of a send up of it, but it also obviously there's an obvious love for the film and to me and Queen Christina, like you said, is another reference because Peter Jerome was essentially like an old Hollywood queen. Like he loved these old Hollywood films.
And you know what else he reminded me of? He reminded me as like a British guy who actually worked as a publicist for Paramount for a while, and I think worked on Carol Reed's The Third Man. That was one of his day jobs before he kind of accidentally fell into porn. He reminded me, his trajectory kind of reminded me of Ken Russell in terms of there's like obviously like a strange colonial gaze, like a British colonial gaze going on, and like a whimsy and almost Rabelaisian kind of sensibility with mixing the high and low and the grotesque and like the almost pre-Raphaelite imagery that's going on. Like there's just an interesting dialogue between those two filmmakers of like I don't know, like formalism and then and baseness or objection. Um, and I kept thinking about that, particularly when watching Adam and Eve, is like all of these like ornate classical flourishes, and then like these asides about dipping your baguette in piss.
Yeah, the high and low is the mixing of the high and low is so queer. And even just, the way it's shot, like it's very beautiful, but it's also obviously like there's a budget, like a very real budget here. But it's again like the film is actually shot in Paris,
Mm-hmm.
except for a lot of the interior scenes. So there is like this hearkening to like a higher tradition of art, right? Just by
Mm-hmm.
putting us in Europe, we're not in like, whereas, his short film Scenes from a Crosstown Bus is much more rooted in like this gritty porn New York 70s world. And then here we go to Europe and we have this, relationship between the American and the Frenchman, which is obviously very Last Tango in Paris. Yeah, what did you yeah, go for it.
I think just like the cosmopolitan sensibility. I also, I was rewatching this film for the first time in a while, and it was pretty striking to me that the American was topping the Frenchman, I think, in the first scene, and that's ultimately reversed, which I had forgotten that they flipped. But they kind of automatically established this idea of like American machismo and then almost like European effeminacy. That I thought was pretty interesting. And they do parody the butter scene from Last Tango in Paris. Um, and I mean, also, I think utilizing the open secret of like bisexual Marlon Brando to this end is really fascinating because I think it was Richard Pryor's wife who recently came out with a book detailing that Marlon Brando had an affair with Richard Pryor and perhaps James Baldwin and Marvin Gaye, and then going back to Kenneth Anger in the Hollywood Babylon books, there's this whole sequence about James Dean being like a total S&M sub at clubs and being used as a human ashtray by Marlon Brando.
So
And
hot.
I know.
So hot.
So I think they're definitely like playing on that in like maybe like a tongue-in-cheek or cock and mouth way.
I fucking love that. I mean, yeah, absolutely. The Hollywood Babylon stuff. I mean, that's sort of why I'm talking about this love that Peter Jerome has for these like old Hollywood movies, because it's so Kenneth Anger, right? For those of you who don't know, Kenneth Anger was a child actor, and
Mm-hmm.
he was in a very early film, Midsummer Night's Dream, as a child actor, and he was very involved in Hollywood, and he writes this book, Hollywood Babylon, which is considered like a very like trashy tome. Would very much set the stage for like the likes of Perez Hilton, to be honest, of like this, trashy, gay, gossipy Hollywood thing. Of course, Hollywood Babylon is wonderful and Perez Hilton is a horrible, horrible man. But it's, kind of this idea of like gossip as queer coded, right? Like there's so much history there of like queer people existing on the fringes of life, but also being part of it. Like these Hollywood actors, these Hollywood elites that are playing straight for the American audience and then like having these debauched, queer, fucked up lives off screen, is very much that book kind of brings that tradition into the mainstream.
Yeah, and speaking of bisexual visibility week, I mean Greta Garbo, her alleged affairs with Marlene Dietrich and like who else was she fucking? There was someone else fun. I don't know. I think she maybe had it's rumored that she maybe had relationships with Valeska Gert. And I think they're definitely also playing on that subtext and that like kind of florid insinuation by utilizing the iconography of both Marlon Brando and Greta Garbo as these fraught and enigmatically bisexual archetypes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Marlon Brando getting fucked by a woman in Last Tango in Paris with like she rubs her fist in butter and sticks it up his ass. It iconic bisexual scene, and yeah, of course that has to be part of this, right? Because of this, the way that queer people, sort of like mine these histories for images of ourselves, this like these gorgeous leading men like Marlon Brando and James Dean. It's so exciting to imagine their debauched queer lives off screen.
Yeah, and also thinking about just the idea of like playing erotic games, which I feel like is like a distinct like kind of like parody of the French sensibility or the European sensibility and by extension the queer sensibility of like these like trading like venomous little barbs at like a cocktail party or like turning everything into a bit like I mean I think that happens kind of loosely and almost like in a peripheral way in this film because I think if you were just watching it ambiently, which I'm sure a lot of people in adult theaters were doing at the time, like the game isn't like the it doesn't feel like the emphasis to me. And they also seem kind of nonchalant about whatever games it is that they're playing. But that, speaks to the camp sensibility and how we just turn things into bits and, have our own codes and like, shadow etiquettes.
Absolutely. I mean, I also love this, what you just said about this kind of like French thing of like these erotic games. That is so French. It makes me think of the book The Image, the Jean de Berg erotic S&M book, and that the whole story of that is there's a woman and a man, playing these erotic games with this female sub, speaking of Bisexual Visibility Week. And, but they're all like very funny while also being like very sexy. And very like casual, like they're at dinner and they make her like stick a bunch of grapes in her pussy underneath the table, stuff like that. So that's very like, haha, like we're integrating the sexual into our social interactions in a way that's like very not American.
Yeah, and like histoire de eau with like,
Mm-hmm.
having to keep your lips pursed in public at all times so you can always be accessible for entry. Like, the French sensibility is alive and well in this film. And in its friction with the American imaginary.
Oh yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, actually, yeah, I didn't get to watch all of the short erotic films of Peter Derome, but the one that stood out the most that seemed kind of like an interesting synthesis between European and American modes of filmic expression was Mumbo Jumbo, which seemed like it was, taking the lexicon of capitalism and like utilizing all of these like found ad jingles, which happened a lot in porn. Like I was thinking of like almost Solka's Wedding
I
and
was
like all
gonna
of those,
say, yeah,
right?
those intercuts with the radio are amazing.
They're out of control. They're completely unhinged. But yeah, the mumbo jumbo basically takes like found advertising jingles and like imagery from uh, you know, magazine advertisements at the time and then sets them to pornography and kind of creates this like non-linear narrative out of them. And that felt very Godard and very French New Wave, which was obviously invested in like a socialist critique of capitalism. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm Sulka's Wedding, for those of you who don't know, is a very famous trans American trans porn. Um, and it's really fucking funny.
Mhm.
There's like during the sex scenes, there are these like fake radio advertisements for products. Like, for example, when two women are eating each other out, there's an ad for Curly's Cunt Wash. And I recently screened it on for my patrons, and they were all just like losing their mind over the fake ads. But yes, and it's especially interesting because Peter Jerome is a Brit living
Mhm.
in New York. So there's kind of like a mix of like British humor and also this like very blatant like American capitalist sort of critique going on.
Cheeky, 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 for sure.
Very, very, yes. And what I Adam and Eve, like, just to say is a beautiful film. Like
Mhm.
um I was very into it. Especially there's like shades of Maya Deren, which happens again in Destroying Angel with these really artful overlays. Um and I just love the nod to like there's a jerking off scene in a museum, and the mixing. I always love the mixing of the high and the low, which is like super present in this.
Yeah, and also thinking about European sensibilities in porn, like I believe it was in like 1969 that Denmark was the first to legalize pornography officially, and then the market really got booming in America. And then I think after Boys in the Sand, it really trickled throughout the rest of the world. And there's so many different cultural approximations and productions of eroticism that have their own intricate and ambivalent relationships with each other. And I think it was I think it was Hot Pants in the short films of Peter Jerome that won like a international Denmark Wet Dream Award at like the Wet Dream Festival or something. I
The
was reading.
Wet Dream Festival. That's so good.
And then I'm not sure if this is actually, we might have to fact check this, but I was reading something wild in my research last night that like apparently child pornography wasn't illegal in Denmark until 1980.
Oh, that's
Um,
wild.
so we might have to do, because I know like Denmark was like the hotbed of like international like porn glamour for a while, and
Yeah,
it brought,
Denmark and Sweden, right?
yeah, yeah, and then France, a lot of the really like interesting classic French porns happen in the 80s, and they're, infused with a particularly innately French form of melancholy and sometimes cinema verite and arguably nihilism. But we can get to that later. I think with Denmark, just like thinking of this film in particular, which Hot Pants is uh, kind of Hot Pants kind of reminded me of Kenneth Anger a little bit. Because it's like an extreme close up of like a black male's like groin in like tight pants, and it's set to Hot Pants by James Brown, and it's kind of like half like visceral dance moment, and then it culminates in like an ejaculation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of contemporary music, or the short film, I believe it's Brown Sugar, where it's just a black man stripping naked for the camera. That whole thing, there's no audio from the actual scene happening. It's all popular music. Um, and that's the music is a big part of his films, like especially if we want to get into Destroying Angel, where that opens with the Pink Floyd song. These and it's also very intentional because the Destroying Angel is much more of like a droning kind of surreal psychedelic soundtrack, whereas Adam and Eve is like more romantic. So he's very good at setting the scene through film. I mean, he's very good at setting the scene through music.
Yeah, and it kind of is the blueprint in certain ways for how the music of the avant-garde is utilized in horror cinema. I think like a lot of people who have only had access sonically to John Cage or Diamant de Galas through the lens of horror films, you know, it's hard for them to come around to the myriad listening pleasures of the avant-garde outside of that context.
Absolutely. I mean, horror, I mean, an Italian horror was so, very much about this like droning avant garde music. And it's, yeah, I would just love to hear more about what you have to say about that in relation to horror,
Mhm.
the avant garde.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's one of those things where you have to reprogram yourself. I don't know. I grew up like listening to a lot of stuff, but the avant-garde was firmly like I'm not like one of those kids who grew up like and my parents were like playing like the Boredoms or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, um, I don't know. I think also, I mean, maybe we can use the fact that David Ernest created this lush Baroque orchestral score for Adam and Eve, and then created this fake funk number for the black male orgy scene that Peter Jerome wrote lyrics for called Honey Man. And the vocalist is completely absent from the credits. We have no idea if it was a black vocal performer or someone doing like an approximation of a black vocal. And that's really interesting to me, is that negative space that exists around this like parody or approximation of like a down and dirty like shaft like funk song,
Yeah, that's really
um,
interesting.
which also really exists kind of I wouldn't say uh, dissonantly within the context of the rest of the film, but it is very much like its own self-contained sequence and like non sequitur that exists purely through the lens of fetishization.
And
Um,
it sets the stage for the way that porn is now, the way that, ebony is its own category of porn, and that like persists to this day, even though of course there's many people that are trying to make that not happen, many porn creators. But yeah, you're right. Like there's this very kind of classic Baroque romantic score in the rest of the film, and then there's just this kind of outlier. And even in the Brown Sugar short that I was talking about, that's all like funk and soul music.
yes, and it really reminded me of this particular essay called "The Glass Closet: Hypervisibility and Scopic Regimes of Knowing" by C. Riley Snorton, and it's utilizing the idea of the epistemology of the closet by Eve Sedgwick, and seeing how representations of the Black erotic contemporary culture contribute to this idea of a ghetto-centric imagination. Um, but this idea of like the glass closet as a space of containment and hyper visibility, where almost going back to the idea of a human museum and like the Hottentot Venus of like, you know, black bodies constantly being on display, ridiculed, made a spectacle of, while also being trapped in the parameters of that, you know, culturally crafted identity.
Yeah, absolutely. I love everything you just said. Sorry, I'm like I was just absorbing what you were talking about. Yeah, absolutely, and it kind of got me thinking about my the amazing artist and my former boss, M. Lamar,
M.
who,
Lamar was your boss?
yes, I was his artist assistant. So anytime you see those photos where with the white men with the whips shoved up their asses, I took those photos. So
I didn't know that part of your story at all.
yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. And I'm still a huge fan of his work. And something I love about the way that his work disrupts this is his use of classical operatic music, which people typically associate with Western white artistic achievements. And then M. Lamar is just like his operatic vocals combined with these images of like him shoving whips in a Robert Mapplethorpe reversal up these white men's asses is just, chef's kiss.
Yeah, M. Lamar. I've only gotten to see them perform once at I think the Poetry Project New Year's Day Marathon, but it was gorgeous, and and you know obviously you know really a a vocal fan of Diamanda Galas's work, who I wanted to find a way to bring up because I think she had a cover. She was like the cover of On Our Backs magazine in one issue, and it says like the demonic diva exposed on the cover, so you assume it's going to be a nude centerfold, but it's sadly not. But
Damn it.
and you know, and thinking about yeah, I mean, obviously M. Lamar and Diamanda and their relationship to the erotic and the avant-garde. I don't know if there's a tidy correlation we could make to what we're talking about today, but definitely bears mentioning.
Yeah, totally. And I know that M. Lamar is a huge fan of her. And, you know, just.
So I was her intern for a summer. So
oh my God, look at us. Look at us. Yeah.
To complete the cycle.
Yeah, that's so funny. Thank you, Diamanda and M. Lamar, for letting us brag about working for you. And speaking of the Gothic, because, you know, M. Lamar has this whole kind of school of thought and aesthetic that he's pioneered called the Negro Gothic. The Destroying Angel is based on an Edgar Allan Poe short story, William Williamson, which is about a gambling roustabout who meets his doppelganger.
And this got me thinking of the history of the double throughout cinema and literature. This film in particular, I think maybe we should introduce the idea that these two films that are the only feature-length film in Peter de Rome's oeuvre before he retired from film for various reasons. I think he contributed to a couple of films, and he planned on making a parody of the classic film Grand Hotel called Grand Motel, with Casey Donovan and Peter Berlin, that never came to fruition. But these films are very discrete objects, thematically, tonally. Like, I don't think I've ever seen quite something like The Destroying Angel in terms of like actively cultivating a bad trip in pornography. There's a couple of analogs in straight porn, and I think a film called Through the Looking Glass came out around the same time. I think maybe the same year, 1976. And that film deals with incest and generational trauma in a disturbing way with explicit pornography. And that's like the only thing that I can think of tonally that compares to what we're talking about today.
I'm also thinking of The Infernal Mansion, or Dragoose, from 1976. Which you should definitely watch. I think you would love it. But directed by Patrice Rome, and it's a straight porn, and I think there's some probably soft girl on girl in it, but it's it's like an erotica with a plot, right? It's one of those, but yes, lots of like surreal psychedelic imagery and tonally dark pornography the way that this is. I mean, Peter de Rome said that he opened Destroying Angel with a representation of bad sex on purpose because he was like, we should see the good and the bad. And I love him for that because it's such a fucking uncomfortable and unsexy scene.
And that directly correlates with like Leo Bersani's Is the Rectum a Grave, where the first sentence is literally like, there's a truth about sex that people don't want to admit. It's not always good.
Yeah.
To paraphrase loosely.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Do you know when Is the Rectum a Grave comes out?
1981, I'm pretty sure. Let me double check my notes, but 1987.
Okay, yeah. And yes, very much precursor to that text, which is he recently died, and if you're listening to this and you haven't read any of his work, go read it immediately. So applicable to so much queer theory that we talk about on this podcast. But so it's based on William Williamson very loosely. And but it's also based on this book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, which was I'd never heard of, but it's a controversial book from the 1970s that proposes that early Christians invented Jesus Christ through their use of psychedelic mushrooms.
Yes, and stemming back to ancient Mesopotamian fertility cults, which this does have kind of like the lens of a certain type of like British colonial anthropology. Um, I haven't read the book. I've read some quotes, but it does have like that the golden bough kind of vibe, like and there does and that kind of speaks to like things that Ken Russell was interested in with like altered states and like which has its own problems with like this archetype of like the noble savage and like indigeneity being inherently mystical, and there's some of that going on here, but still it's like a remarkable premise for a gay pornography from 1976, to combine these two things and these like disparate ideas of urine as transfiguration ritual, um, and and ideologically inherited trauma from a Catholic upbringing.
Yeah, it's quite singular, and you can rent it, by the way, on pinklabel.tv, which is like a really great queer porn streaming service that I use a lot. Um,
And Pink Label is run by Shine Louise Houston, right?
oh, I'm not sure.
Let me see, because we love Shine, um, who is someone who's at the forefront of a lot of progressive contemporary pornography. Oh no, I always get it mixed up. It's Pink and White Productions, not Pink Label.
Okay, yeah, right. Yeah, their names are so similar. um, yeah, so Pink, you can get that on Pink Label. I really recommend watching it. It's really, really amazing. If you're a fan of this podcast, you will like that movie. And it's not necessarily sexy. um, but it is to me, but it's also, yeah, I was into it, but
I was the outlier because I feel like a lot of people are like find Adam and Eve more canonically
no, I think this one is
titillating.
way hotter.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I mean, I had to ask anybody had to tell me that the first scene is supposed to be bad sex because I was like, oh, this looks like a hot, fucked up sexual encounter. And there's so much like ambiguous consent in this film. I mean, it's about a young priest named Caswell Campbell, which is obviously a nod to like William Williamson, who he's about town, and he's really torn between the call of the cloth and the lure of the flesh, as it were. And while he's on sabbatical, he like plunges into the world of gay sex and magic mushrooms. And it's like an experimental horror porn, and I fucking loved it. And very much shades of Maya Deren, but I was also thinking about Derek Jarman, in this tradition of homoerotic Catholic saint imagery, like Saint Sebastian, and particularly Jarman's Sebastian from 1976, from the same year.
Absolutely. I was also thinking that there's another porn from 1970 that only became a porn because they realized they had to add hardcore content for it to be profitable, but it's the Amaro Brothers Bacchanal, that came out a couple years before this, but it's a straight porn made by two gay brothers that is a loose kind of like retelling of like Dante's Inferno, very loose. And I think the idea between these crises of faith uh, are very palpable in the spirit of the 70s, before satanic panic really becomes a thing in the 80s. And this film really does have a lot of like nascent ideologies that it I'm not sure if I can call it like ahead of its time, but there's definitely the embryonic structures of like a lot of really interesting theory that completely comes to fruition in the 80s.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it's very much like of its time, right? But
Yeah,
it's because, like, an experimental horror porn about the occult. Like, come on, that's the 70s in a nutshell.
yeah.
But you're right. At the same time, it sets the groundwork for so much of what we're going to be talking about in queer art in the 1980s. But of course, Satanic Panic like effectively put the stop to queer, like this kind of occult revival that was happening at the time. The Manson murders really put the kibosh on that in 1969, and then by the time we get to the 1980s and we're in full-blown Satanic Panic, like that is very like verboten. But queer people have always loved Satan. I mean, look at Kenneth Anger. So
Yeah.
so is there anything else that you were thinking of with this film in particular?
Sure. I mean, I think Tim Kent, who plays the lead of Caswell Campbell, it's his only pornographic appearance in a film, and he is not the stock archetype for what you would consider a lead protagonist in a gay male porn would be.
No, yeah, not at all. Yeah.
He's what you'd consider like maybe a nebbish, and he has like a page boy haircut. He takes the passive role in most of the scenes. It's very subby. It's very self-flagellating, like in the traditional Catholic guilt kind of way. Um, yeah, I think his performance is really interesting. And throughout the film, he's startled by apparitions of his double, who has noticeably a larger cock than he does, and also has like this very like rote mechanical laugh that goes like ah, ah,
It's really insane.
yeah, just like this terrifying grimace. He's like often spotted in like apartment like windows like menacingly jerking off. And then I think he does actually end up having a threesome with his
With
well
his
endowed
doppelganger, yeah.
sinister double, but they don't actually do they make direct contact, or
I
is it
don't
like
think so. Yeah, and it's honestly, they talk about this in Ask Anybody too, like the the way that they shot it and like the splicing of the film and stuff is really good. They did a really good job with what they had. I mean, you really you can tell, but it's almost like you can tell it like adds to it. I don't know. There's something about it where, the artifice of it adds to the uncanny nature of the whole scene.
100%? And like that reminds me kind of like when a lot of porn was being shot on film that didn't allow for live audio and the sound syncing is slightly off or not entirely like synchronized, like that kind of adds to the uncanny nature of a lot of these films. And like there is like Kurt McDowell made a kind of a 3-hour bisexual camp epic porn called Thundercrack that like is
Which
supposed
I
to be
still have to see.
oh, you would love it.
I
You
know
would
everybody
love
keeps
it.
telling me to watch it.
Which George Kuchar actually has a pretty big part in. But these films are completely different. That is very much like a very like explicitly vulgar send up of like the old dark house narrative, and has to do with it's almost more of like a gothic sex farce, where this is, I don't want to say playing it straight, but like the horror is palpable.
Yeah, it's not a funny movie, Destroying Angel, in whereas Adam and Eve is like very cheeky.
Yes.
This is not. They're actually really different films, and yeah, to like you were saying, to have them as as Peter Jerome's two feature length films is really interesting, because we have this like really dark exploration of the tortured subconscious, contrasted with, everything we just talked about in Adam and Eve. There's also a lot more sadomasochism in this one. It's a much kinkier film. Like the gangbang, the orgy is still there, but this is a piss orgy, where all of these men piss on the protagonist.
Yeah, and that's supposed to directly reference this arcane ritual of getting high through drinking the piss of people who are high on mushrooms. And that's supposed to be a direct contact with some sort of divinity. You know, if that wasn't abundantly clear.
Yeah, I mean, come on, guys.
um, I do want to mention that I did try to do a little sleuthing around David Ernest, and I can't find any direct information about him on the internet. But there is a composer who's in his 80s named John David Ernest who composes for operas and like orchestras, and his CV on his website is conspicuously blank around the time these two films were made and around the time that Hand in Hand Productions was in full swing. And adding to that, one of his recent pieces was called Songs for Hadrian, which was utilizing text written by Arch Brown, who is also a Hand in Hand auteur. So
Okay.
I'm not saying it's the same guy, but I'm not saying it's the same guy.
Oh my God, I love this detective work. And he's in his 80s. Like, come on, it's probably him. I mean, it sounds very likely.
And he's like a university professor, so I imagine that maybe, you know, he's not playing into the more prurient aspects of his career.
But I kind of love that. I like secrets and mystery, and I don't think straight people deserve to know about the things that we do.
Yeah, and that's definitely, you know, part of our milieu is harnessing the power of the unspoken and negative space in our, you know, collective and subjective histories, and utilizing that as a path to move forward. I think we'll get into that more with a lot of the auteurs that we plan on covering. But there is just a lot of alias, a lot of pseudonym, a lot of actually, maybe it would be helpful to bring in this quote that I have from this great book called Porn Work, Sex, Labor, and Capitalism by Heather Berg. And it is, pornodialectics are messier than conventional stories of class struggle because class boundaries are less calcified here. Porn workers are very rarely only workers. Instead, they occupy constantly shifting class positions as entrepreneurs, independent contractors, formal employees, contracted and freelance managers, and producers. This shapes and reshapes their perspectives in countless ways. And I'm not the best Marxist, like historically, but this book has been really fascinating in its, you know, like queer Marxist critique of the porn industry as it exists now, and where a lot of people are shifting away from the narrative, which was very much a political tool in these classic porns of the 70s to, like, you know, like represent how gay men live their lives, and to have visibility in this way and to empower themselves to the erotic. And now a lot of people are producing their own content, and the individual is, like, you know, in charge of, like, you know, all of their assets, and they're not being mismanaged or extracted. But that being said, there's a lot less emphasis on storyline, narrative, you know, like, which is, you know, interesting. I wonder if there will be a return to like an experimental art porn, or like if there will be funding that will like kind of like materialize around like these independent contractors and sex workers, you know what I mean?
I think there will be. I mean, that is my hope. I find through the work that I'm doing, and maybe you see this in the work that you do too, that there is a resurgence of interest in this. And
Very much
artists,
so.
yeah,
Yeah.
artists going back to queer porn. And I know that with like the contentification of everything and censorship and the way that a lot of contemporary art now, or contemporary media, is just kind of boring and sexless, in my opinion. I think people are really hungry for experimental porn. So I think that we will see, you know, a move back. And of course, there's still folks that have been doing this, like at Aorta Films and Four Chamber Productions. There are very much still like queer porn, experimental queer porn makers. but I would love it if the culture around these kinds of films that we're talking about in this series would come back.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what
And
we're doing here.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an interesting trend towards like autofiction in porn. And like, I think reality television has definitely catalyzed that in a lot of ways. I think the people who run, do you know Mondo Fetiche?
Yeah, I love Mondo Fetiche.
Yeah, I love the work that they do. I think maybe for another episode, but have you seen that wild like experimental porn that Brooke Candy directed, like for the
I
Pornhub Auteurs series?
have, yes.
I'm a big fan of that one.
I
I wonder.
actually love that. Yeah, I love
Yeah,
that movie. Yeah. Brooke Candy, questionable person, but
sure.
yeah, but that her film was great.
Yeah, it
The
was really cool.
glitter coming out of Asa Akira's asshole in the beginning.
Gorgeous. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, amazing. I have this quote here that maybe we can end on about Peter Jerome from Maitland McDonough for Film Comment in 2013. And there's actually not a lot of scholarly writing about Peter Jerome out there. Uh, so Matlin says the cinema of forbidden delights thrives on the fringes, defined in opposition to prevailing cultural and aesthetic norms and shaped by unconventional sensibilities. But norms shift, and 4 decades later, Jerome's films look new again. Graphic but not reductive, at once bewitchingly dreamlike and down to earth, they play like captured moments that celebrate acts of both the imagination and the flesh. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I will say that I don't find a lot of classic gay pornography of this era like intrinsically erotic. And I was surprised about rewatching The Destroying Angel and parts of Adam and Eve that I was like, oh, huh. Because I do like I kind of try to coin this term ambient porno for a lot of the work that came out that is very narrative driven, but also meant for public consumption. And I think that shifts obviously with the advent of like the video industry, but a lot of these films I personally think were intended to wash over a public space, um, and to be supplementary to whatever is developing um, within the erotic commons. uh,
Absolutely. You're supposed to go to the theater and watch this and like fucking suck in the theater while it's happening. So it's very much like vibe based, as the kids would say.
yeah, it's all about vibes.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think like it's almost the wrong context to like sit down and at the MoMA and watch this movie like start to finish. It's you're kind of supposed to be letting it wash over you while you get your dick sucked.
Yeah, and even that, I mean, like thinking of like an institutional viewing of this retrospectively is fascinating because I think that our erotic consciousness has definitely transformed. I'm not sure if I would say it's progressed, but I think that I was reminded, this might be like a bit abstract, but I was reminded of like The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley when I was thinking about this, where it's like people had less access to light. And so when like villages were lit up at night, it was more likely for you to have a kind of transcendent experience because you were not used to that. And I think that our erotic consciousness has changed in a way that we're, obviously in certain ways desensitized to like filmic representations of sex and like the pornographic. But I imagine there must have been so much more of an initial like somatic impulse or reaction or affect from watching these films as a person who has never seen, or perhaps has never seen, hardcore pornography in this way in a public space. Like I can't purport to imagine or empathize with how that felt for like a young queer person of any sort, closeted or otherwise, to and who knows, maybe their visceral reactions were completely different to us watching it retrospectively like 40 years later.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a great point. I love the Aldous Huxley reference. I think it's really apt because it's our experience of these is completely different than it would have been when it first hit the scene, because we've seen so much porn, like it's so readily available, and this is something that I think someone would watch and they would be like, this is kind of boring, because like they're not, it's, you can't see everything very clearly. Porn is so like bathed in light now, like it's just everything is lit. You can see everything happening, going in and out of holes, like very explicitly. And that's in these films too, but there's this shroud of like secrecy and darkness over it that is much more in line with the queer sexual experiences that were happening at the time. Queerness being shrouded in mystery and darkness. Whereas now it's center stage in the liberalification and contentification of media, and that's reflected in pornography.
Yeah, and these works definitely mirror the philosophy and the trajectory of cruising, like of discovery, of curiosity, of dark spaces, of like what is obscured, of what is found. And now it's all out there on the table.
Yeah, exactly. Like we said in the beginning of the episode, like what does transgression mean when there's no more taboos to break? And I think that's probably why incest porn is so popular now, because that's one of like the very true last taboos that people, it's sacrosanct, like you don't violate that. And I think that's, people are very confused as to why that's very popular right now, and I'm like, well, that's why, because it's the ultimate taboo still. Everything else is so easily seen.
I think that there's also something interesting to be said about like the bug chasing porns of like Treasure Island Media, and like, like the idea of, I think there's one that was really controversial where it's like a guy taking like 40 viral loads and like his ass like in like a giant like turkey baster or something, and like the provocation of that, and also histories of like AIDS activism and like like guerrilla activists like knowingly injecting themselves with AIDS, I think in Cuba, and like like that, going back to the idea of, is the rectum a grave, and like how we can identify with the death drive in queer eroticism as a formal strategy against respectability.
Oh God, I love that. I mean, sadomasochism, that's all about the death drive and the relationship between death and sensuality that Georges Bataille talks about. Did you see this discourse on, are you on Twitter at all?
I should be. I have like a fake Twitter.
You should. I mean, honestly, I can't in good conscience recommend that you get on Twitter because it's a horrible place, but I would like to hear your thoughts about discourse. And the discourse du jour is that some fag posted a poll on his Twitter that was like, is it unethical if I go to a gangbang, no loads refused?
Oh, I saw this.
Yes.
I saw this on the Facebook group Grinder Aesthetics Thunderdome, which used to be just called Grinder Aesthetics, but it got shut down, and now Thunderdome was supposed to be the place where everyone just talks shit about each other.
So funny.
But yeah, I mean, I think even asking that question is
even asking the question, itself. You know that you shouldn't go. But there's been like a whole debate about this. Like, so the guy asked, is it unethical to go to a no loads rejected gangbang if the recipient of the loads has me blocked, but it's no loads refused, and then put a poll. So there's now debate on Twitter, like, is it unethical if this guy goes to the no loads refused gangbang? And I don't know. I just find everything about this really fascinating from, going off what you talked about bug chasing porn. Right now, we're not really allowed to touch each other or be around each other because of COVID and monkeypox. And so I think that's part of, I mean, it's an outrageous tweet. So of course it was going to get attention, but sure. Also just, I think it's so like, it's a huge taboo right now to even be having a party like that.
Speaking of which, I wonder if this is perhaps pertinent to discuss, but what was your experience of Folsom this year in the midst of like, ongoing contagion and like in regards to what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I mean, my experience, so I've been to Folsom a few times, and I've been to Folsom East in New York, and I would say that there's definitely like a more dirgeful air to it. The last time I went was before the pandemic, and it was much more celebratory. This one, you know, it was more so like in the women and trans non-binary area, the protocols around COVID and monkeypox were being much more respected. But you know how the boys are.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was.
Say less, as they say.
Yeah. And I tend to stay in like the women and trans area when I go to Folsom, just because like it's so like gay man centric.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it was like pervy as ever, like there's naked dudes walking around like jerking off, and so many muscle gays and harnesses. And, it was like nothing had changed. And yet there's just this air over it that I imagine was what life was like during what approximation of like what life was like during the height of the AIDS crisis. It's like we're still trying,
Yeah.
like we're here and we're still trying to have fun. And of course, like there was so much play happening in the women and trans area. Like in the tent, there was, lots of people fucking and playing. But definitely a lot less strangers coming up and asking to be part of scenes than there would be in years past.
Sure.
That was my
Sure.
experience. But it, just a lot less like touching. That said, I think the Bay Area is actually, the monkeypox cases right now are like pretty low. And there was also a tent at Folsom for monkeypox vaccinations, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But leather communities have historically always been on the forefront of conversations about STI transmission and consent and all of that stuff.
Incredibly organized, incredible in their mobility and their way of crowdsourcing, ethically and yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. So yeah, I still had a good time, but it was also, I mean, I'm just so traumatized from the last couple of years. I'm sure you can relate. And like, I'm just not used to a world where, I can't, I'm just changing. It's changing. Like the way that I conduct myself in these spaces is changing. And I imagine these are also changes and shifts that people had to make, my queer ancestors had to make,
Yeah.
30, 40 years ago. So.
Yeah, and everyone, I mean, I worked I still bartend at a queer space where I live in Connecticut, and I worked through the pandemic, I think, like as a bartender, when there was like so many different regulations and like like CDC guidelines changing every day. Like, so my experience is, I mean, undoubtedly different from a lot of people who I think are still emerging or still navigating risk in a very isolated way, and like like immunocompromised people, and like I don't know, I felt like I was, I'm obviously not gonna say like on the front lines, but I think that my risk of exposure was different from a lot of people's, like having to do service work throughout that. So yeah, I mean, and I think everyone kind of navigates their sense of responsibility and risk in like different ways, and it's like hard in a society mired by late capitalism not to be hypocritical when like engaging with these paradigms that are provided for us.
Oh, absolutely. I even find myself in like, I've been very like, good girl, I guess. I
Yeah.
mean, I kind of hate that sort of rhetoric around the pandemic stuff because I don't feel like like it's morally neutral. Like it's not. It's just something that you're supposed to do to mitigate risk.
Yeah.
But and I've been very like quote unquote good about it. But even I, as at Folsom, I was like had my mask like on or off, on and off because it's just like no one else is wearing one. And then, and I know logically, like, that doesn't mean I should take mine off. But, there's all this emotional, complex shit wrapped up in this, especially because our government has abandoned us. So, um, you know, if anything, I'm trying to find strength in the closeness I feel going through this in the way that I'm sure that our queer ancestors during the AIDS crisis were going through it. So finding strength in that,
Yeah,
working
and to
towards
make a
that.
direct line between like, the work that we talked about with the Dreamlanders and John Waters and the work of like organizing around gay pornography and activism. And I think queer resilience through like creating, networks of care and, like caregiving as, like an innately queer enterprise, like, like I think that all tracks completely. Like and like I think through the pandemic, we definitely like kind of like, like bolstered our solidarity and our sense of community, even removed from physical manifestations of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know that I've gotten really involved with queer disabled community a lot more during the pandemic. And, I'm glad that those conversations are coming more to the forefront. I mean, part of the issue I always have with these festivals, and Folsom is included in that, is just the lack of accessibility for disabled queer people, and even myself contributing to that, taking not wearing my mask. A mass of unmasked people is not safe for a immunocompromised queer disabled person. So, yeah, a lot heavy note to end on, perhaps, but this is only the first part of Anal Auteurs, and we will be back to talk about Jack DeVoe, Fred Halstead, and Wakefield Poole.
Yeah,
So,
thanks so much for having me. This is an exciting adventure for us.
yes, thank you so much for being a guest, and I'll see you all next time.